I was 27 years old when I realized that the story I had been told about my birth was carefully designed to protect everyone except me. And that realization did not arrive gently or all at once, but unfolded slowly, painfully, and with a sense of betrayal that settled into my chest and refused to leave. The discovery did not happen during an argument or a dramatic family moment, which made it worse, because it happened on an ordinary afternoon when I was searching for a document my parents insisted they had already given me years ago. And ordinary moments are where lies feel most cruel once exposed. My name is Alyssa Monroe, and until that day, I believed I knew exactly who I was, where I came from, and why certain questions in my childhood were always met with silence disguised as concern. I grew up in a quiet suburb in Pennsylvania, in a house that looked stable from the outside, with parents who valued routine, reputation, and the appearance of normalcy above all else, and for most of my life, I accepted that structure without questioning the gaps it created. My mother, Deborah Monroe, was careful in the way she loved, measuring affection through control and consistency, rather than warmth, while my father, Gregory Monroe, believed deeply in order, tradition, and avoiding discomfort, especially when discomfort threatened the image of a well-managed family. They were not cruel in obvious ways. They were precise, and precision is far more dangerous when it comes to hiding the truth. Growing up, I always sensed that something about my early life was treated differently, not spoken about with the casual nostalgia other families shared, but locked away behind vague explanations and subtle redirections whenever curiosity surfaced. When I asked about old photos, my mother changed the subject. When I asked about hospital stories, my father gave short, unsatisfying answers and moved on quickly. At the time, I assumed privacy meant protection. I did not understand that silence can also mean concealment. As an adult, those unanswered questions returned with more urgency, especially as I began preparing documents related to marriage, insurance, and legal records, because paperwork has a way of demanding clarity where people prefer ambiguity. I asked my mother again about my original birth certificate, explaining calmly that I needed it for official reasons, and she responded with immediate defensiveness disguised as confusion, telling me it must be stored somewhere and suggesting I use a copy instead. That reaction unsettled me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was immediate. I waited until my parents were out one afternoon and searched the file cabinet. They kept locked more out of habit than necessity, and what I found there changed the way I understood every quiet moment of my childhood. The document inside was not the certificate I expected. It was an amended record, different hospital, different county, and a date that did not align with the story I had been told my entire life. My hands shook as I read it repeatedly, because denial feels easier than acceptance when the truth threatens your foundation, and I wanted desperately to believe I was misreading something. But paperwork does not lie out of emotion. It lies only when someone has made it lie deliberately. I sat on the floor of that quiet room, holding a version of my existence my parents had never shared, and suddenly, the memories that once felt insignificant began rearranging themselves into something coherent and disturbing. The whispered phone calls, the relatives who never mentioned my birth year, the tension that appeared whenever someone referenced bloodlines or family resemblance. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been imagined. When my parents returned home that evening, I said nothing, not because I was afraid, but because instinct told me that confrontation without understanding would only lead to deflection, and deflection was the skill they had perfected for decades. Instead, I observed. I watched how my mother stiffened when certain topics surfaced. I watched how my father avoided eye contact when I asked general questions about family history. And I realized something deeply unsettling. They knew I was close. That night I did not sleep. Not because I was panicked, but because my mind was working through a lifetime of moments that suddenly made sense, and clarity, once achieved, does not allow rest. I understood then that the truth about my birth had not been hidden to protect me. It had been hidden to protect them. Whatever story they had rewritten, whatever decision they had made, without my consent, and whatever consequences they feared, all of it rested on the belief that I would never question the version of myself they constructed. They were wrong. I did not confront them immediately. Not because I wanted to forgive, not because I wanted to forget, but because I needed to understand exactly how deep the lie went. Who else knew, and how many times my life had been shaped by a truth deliberately withheld? What my parents did not realize was that by hiding my origin, they had created something far more dangerous than conflict. They had created motivation. And motivation, when paired with patience and clarity, eventually demands an answer. I would not scream. I would not beg. I would not allow the truth to be minimized or reframed. When the confrontation came, it would not happen behind closed doors. It would happen openly. And when they finally admitted what they had hidden, they would not control the narrative anymore. Once the truth entered my life, even without being spoken aloud, it changed the way every familiar face looked to me, because suddenly I was not just questioning my parents, I was questioning the silence of everyone who had ever smiled at me, while knowing something essential about my existence had been deliberately withheld. The days following my discovery passed slowly, not because nothing was happening, but because everything was happening internally, rearranging my understanding of family, loyalty, and the quiet agreements people make to protect themselves from discomfort. I continued visiting my parents' house regularly, not out of obligation, but out of strategy, because I needed to observe how deeply the lie had settled into daily life, and whether cracks would appear when I stopped playing the role they expected. My mother, Deborah, became more attentive, in subtle ways, offering unsolicited help, asking unnecessary questions, and hovering just enough to remind me that control had always been her preferred language of care. My father, Gregory, retreated further into routine, spending more time absorbed in work, news, and household tasks, because avoidance was how he managed guilt without acknowledging it. Neither of them mentioned the document. Neither of them asked what I was looking for that day. That silence confirmed everything. People who are innocent ask questions. People who are hiding wait to see if they have been discovered. I began testing the edges of their comfort carefully, asking neutral questions framed as curiosity rather than accusation. Because lies respond differently when approached indirectly. I asked my mother about family medical history, presenting it as a practical concern, and she answered confidently at first, until specifics became unavoidable, at which point her voice tightened, and her answers shortened. I asked my father about extended relatives. I barely knew, mentioning a name from an old photograph, and watched him hesitate before responding, his expression shifting just enough to confirm recognition, mixed with restraint. Those reactions mattered more than any confession could have. They were rehearsed, and rehearsed reactions indicate long-term preparation. As the week progressed, I began reaching out to relatives, not aggressively, but conversationally, because people often reveal more when they believe they are not being investigated. I called my aunt under the pretense of catching up, listening carefully as she reminisced about family gatherings from decades ago, and I noticed how she skipped over the year I was born entirely, moving seamlessly from one memory to another. I asked a cousin about old photos, mentioning how few images I had seen from my infancy, and she laughed nervously before saying she assumed my parents simply valued privacy, a phrase that appeared too frequently to be coincidence. Every interaction reinforced the same conclusion. The truth about my birth was not confined to my parents. It was shared selectively, managed collectively, protected mutually. That realization was more painful than the lie itself, because betrayal multiplied when silence became communal. I began mapping timelines privately, aligning dates, locations, and movements, and the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore once laid out logically, rather than emotionally. Hospitals did not match. Residences overlapped awkwardly. Family events aligned too conveniently with periods of absence. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a coordinated decision. The pressure began subtly once. My parents sensed my shift in behavior, not through confrontation, but through emotional cues designed to test whether obedience could still be reasserted. My mother reminded me how much they had sacrificed for me, framing parenthood as a debt rather than a responsibility, and my father emphasized family unity, warning gently against creating unnecessary conflict. Neither of them asked what I wanted. Neither of them acknowledged my right to know. Their concern was never about my identity. It was about stability. One evening, my mother attempted to steer the conversation toward gratitude, recounting moments of care and provision, as if emotional accounting could erase deception, and I listened quietly, not because I agreed, but because I wanted her to hear herself. She spoke as if love excused dishonesty, as if intention outweighed consequence. That was the moment I understood something crucial. They did not believe they had done anything wrong. They believed the lie was justified because it made life easier for them, would never produce accountability, because accountability requires an audience when self-reflection is absent. People who hide truth for decades do not suddenly respect honesty in private. They reinterpret. They minimize. They rewrite. The pressure intensified when I stopped responding emotionally, when I did not reassure them, when I did not play my role. My calm unsettled them more than anger would have, because calm suggests independence, and independence threatens control. My mother began asking if something was wrong, framing concern as intuition, and my father attempted to restore routine, inviting me to dinners, events, and traditions designed to re-anchor me emotionally. I attended without resistance, because presence without compliance confuses manipulators. Meanwhile, I continued gathering context. I learned from a distant relative that there had been a period of intense stress around the time of my birth, a situation involving extended family and reputation concerns that had required discretion, a word that suddenly carried weight. I learned that legal paperwork had been handled unusually carefully, that certain records had been amended swiftly, and that questions were discouraged even then. Each piece of information did not shock me anymore. It confirmed. By the end of the month, the truth was no longer a suspicion. It was a structure, and structures require dismantling, deliberately, not emotionally. I began planning the confrontation, not as an argument, but as an exposure, because arguments allow denial, while exposure demands response. I chose a future family gathering, one that included extended relatives and longtime family friends, people whose presence would prevent my parents from deflecting or dismissing the truth without consequence. I did not announce anything. I did not warn them, because warning gives liars time to prepare counter-narratives. Instead, I prepared clarity. I organized documents. I aligned timelines. I rehearsed facts rather than feelings. And most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally to walk away afterward, because confrontation without separation would only invite negotiation. And negotiation was not justice. The hardest realization came quietly one night as I sat alone reviewing everything I had learned. I understood that once the truth was spoken publicly, there would be no return to the version of family I once knew. And that grief was not something to avoid, but something to accept as part of liberation. I was not afraid of losing my parents' approval anymore. I was afraid of losing myself by continuing to accept a story that denied my agency. The truth had already changed me. The confrontation would simply make it visible. And when it was over, I would leave. Not because I hated them, but because staying would mean agreeing. That lies were an acceptable foundation for love. They believed silence had protected the family. They were about to learn that silence had only delayed accountability. By the time the family gathering approached, the truth no longer felt heavy in my hands, because I had carried it long enough for it to harden into certainty, and certainty removes hesitation in a way emotions never can. The event itself was presented as something ordinary, a carefully planned weekend dinner at my parents' home, one of those gatherings designed to reinforce unity, tradition, and the illusion that nothing beneath the surface has shifted. Relatives traveled in from nearby states. Familiar faces filled the house, and conversations floated through the rooms with practiced ease. But beneath that comfort was tension so controlled it almost felt invisible, except to those who knew where to look. I watched my parents closely that evening, noting how my mother managed the environment with precision, guiding conversations, redirecting topics, and ensuring that nothing lingered too long in discomfort, while my father positioned himself as the calm center, offering reassurance through routine rather than honesty. They believed they were hosting. In reality, they were standing inside a moment they could no longer manage. As guests settled in, I felt something unexpected surface within me. Not fear or anxiety, but clarity, because once the decision to speak had been made, uncertainty disappeared, replaced by an almost quiet resolve that surprised even me. I did not rush. I did not seek attention. I waited. People assume confrontation requires aggression, but the most destabilizing confrontations are delivered calmly, because calm leaves no room to dismiss the speaker as emotional or irrational. Dinner passed with polite conversation and surface-level warmth, and I noticed how often my parents glanced in my direction, checking my expression, measuring my tone, attempting to predict something they sensed but could not identify. They knew something was coming. They just did not know when. After the meal, as people settled into the living room, conversations splitting naturally into smaller groups, I recognized the moment for what it was, because timing matters when truth is involved. And this was a room filled with people who had known my parents long enough to recognize avoidance. When it appeared, I stood slowly, not dramatically, but deliberately, and allowed my presence to draw attention naturally, because sudden movements create defense, while deliberate ones invite attention. When the room quieted, I spoke, not loudly, but clearly, because truth does not require volume to carry weight. I began by speaking about identity, about how families shape stories, and about how trust is built, not through perfection, but through honesty. And I could feel the shift in the room. As people listened, uncertain but attentive, I referenced paperwork, dates, records. I spoke about discovering an amended birth certificate and inconsistencies that no explanation had resolved. And I noticed my mother stiffen, her composure tightening in ways she could not fully conceal. My father remained still, but his hands folded more tightly than before. I did not accuse. I did not speculate. I stated facts. Facts do not invite debate. They demand explanation. As the room absorbed the information, murmurs began, not loud enough to interrupt, but present enough to confirm that people were connecting dots they had long avoided acknowledging. I turned my attention to my parents, not aggressively but directly, and asked them to explain, not privately, not later, but now, because the truth hidden collectively requires collective accountability. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded. My mother attempted to regain control first, offering vague reassurances and framing the situation as a misunderstanding. But the tone she used betrayed her urgency, because she was no longer speaking to protect me. She was speaking to protect herself. I responded by placing documents on the table, allowing physical evidence to replace emotional argument, and that action changed everything, because denial loses power when confronted with proof. My father finally spoke, his voice steady but strained, attempting to contextualize the decision as necessary, protective, and made with good intentions. But intention does not erase consequence. And the room understood that. People began asking questions, not aggressively but curiously, because curiosity thrives when silence has ruled for too long, and once the first question is asked, others follow naturally. The narrative my parents had controlled for decades began slipping from their grasp, not through chaos but through exposure. What struck me most was not their explanations, but their inability to acknowledge harm, because even in that moment, their focus remained fixed on why they did what they did, rather than on how it shaped me. That realization settled deeply. I understood then that closure would not come from their apology, because an apology offered only when forced rarely carries accountability. It comes from action, from choice, from refusal to accept rewritten truths. I spoke again, calmly, explaining that what hurt most was not the origin of the truth, but the sustained decision to deny me ownership of my own identity, to allow others to know while insisting I remain unaware. The room was silent now, not out of shock, but out of recognition. Recognition that something irreversible had occurred. I told them that family cannot exist where truth is optional, and that love cannot thrive where control replaces respect. And I made it clear that this was not a moment of reconciliation, but of acknowledgement. I did not ask for forgiveness. I did not ask for explanation. I stated my decision. I explained that I would be stepping away, not temporarily, not as punishment, but permanently, because boundaries are not threats, they are decisions. My mother reacted emotionally then, not with understanding, but with fear, because control slipping away often manifests as concern. And my father attempted to negotiate, emphasizing time, space, and healing. But healing requires consent from those harmed, not convenience for those responsible. I declined calmly. I explained that walking away was not rejection, but preservation. and that remaining would only perpetuate a dynamic built on silence. As I gathered my things, the room remained quiet, not because people did not care, but because they understood the weight of what they had witnessed. No one stopped me. No one argued. Because when truth is spoken fully, interruption feels inappropriate. I left the house that night knowing that the relationship I once had was over. And surprisingly, I did not feel loss the way I expected. I felt space. Space to redefine myself without correction. Space to exist without explanation. Space to carry my identity without negotiation. My parents lost something that night. Not publicly, but fundamentally. They lost the ability to control my narrative. And that loss would linger long. After the guests left, long after the house grew quiet, and long after the truth settled into memory. Because once silence loses its power, it never regains it. The morning after the confrontation arrived without drama, without messages, and without apologies, which told me everything I needed to know about how deeply my parents had believed silence would eventually repair what truth had exposed. I woke up in my apartment, surrounded by a quiet that felt different from loneliness, because this silence was chosen, not imposed. And there is power in that distinction. When you have spent your life reacting to other people's decisions, my phone remained untouched for hours. And when it finally vibrated, the messages were not confessions or accountability, but attempts to soften what could not be undone. Carefully worded expressions of concern that avoided responsibility while asking for patience, understanding, and time. Time had already been taken. Years of it. I did not respond immediately, not because I was unsure, but because clarity deserves space, and reacting too quickly often allows others to reassert influence where it no longer belongs. The days that followed revealed consequences my parents had not anticipated. Not dramatic public shame, but subtle shifts that hurt far more deeply. For people who valued control and reputation, family members began asking questions directly. Stories that had once been whispered cautiously were now spoken openly. The narrative my parents had curated fractured into multiple perspectives, and without a unified version to enforce, the truth expanded naturally. I learned through others that my mother struggled with the loss of authority more than the loss of relationship, because authority had always been how she measured closeness, and without it, she felt exposed rather than reflective. My father retreated further, avoiding gatherings, minimizing interaction, and attempting to preserve dignity by disengagement, because confrontation had never been his strength, and accountability demanded it now. They were not punished through cruelty. They were punished through consequence. Consequence does not announce itself. It settles. I officially changed my records to reflect the truth of my birth, reclaiming documentation that had once been altered without my consent. And that process felt strangely ceremonial, because paperwork, when aligned with truth, restores a sense of ownership that words cannot replace. Each signature felt like a boundary. Each correction felt like reclamation. I informed my parents of my decision to step away formally, not in anger, but in clarity, explaining that distance was necessary for my well-being, and that reconciliation would require more than acknowledgement. It would require transformation. They responded predictably. My mother framed separation as abandonment. My father framed it as misunderstanding. Neither framed it as accountability. That confirmation solidified my resolve. I stopped attending family events. I declined invitations politely. I redirected conversations away from justification. I allowed myself to exist without explaining why. The most unexpected consequence was internal. Without the constant pressure to perform gratitude, obedience, or emotional restraint, I began noticing parts of myself that had been dormant, preferences I had never explored, boundaries I had never enforced, and a confidence that did not rely on approval. Leaving did not feel like loss. It felt like alignment. There were moments of grief, because mourning is natural when letting go of what you wished could have existed. But grief did not weaken my decision. It validated it, because only something meaningful creates sorrow when released. Months later, I learned that my parents struggled privately with the aftermath, not because others judged them harshly, but because the version of themselves they believed in no longer held. People treated them differently, not with hostility, but with awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable for those who rely on control. The punishment was not isolation. It was exposure without erasure. They remained who they were, but they were seen clearly now. I did not celebrate that outcome. I accepted it, because revenge was never my goal. Truth was, and truth carries consequences, regardless of intention. I built a life that did not revolve around explanation, where my identity was not a topic of negotiation, and where love was not conditional on silence. Walking away taught me something vital. You do not owe loyalty to people who required your unknowing compliance to feel secure. You do not owe access to people who rewrote your story without your consent. And you do not owe forgiveness to those who confuse control with care. My parents believed hiding the truth would preserve the family. In reality, it cost them the relationship. They tried to protect through deception. And I learned that sometimes the most powerful act of self-respect is not confrontation, but departure. I did not leave angry. I left whole. If the people who raised you hid the truth about who you are, would you confront them and stay? Or would you walk away to protect your identity?